There is a particular kind of arrogance that does not know it is arrogance. It wears the face of analysis. It speaks in the language of data. It produces charts, strategic assessments, probability matrices, all of them reasonable, all of them internally consistent, all of them describing a world that does not quite exist. The Vaalthari Dominion had this arrogance in abundance. They had cultivated it over 9,000 years of unbroken strategic supremacy, and they wore it the way old civilizations wear their monuments, not as decoration, but as proof of permanence. We must understand the Dominion before we can understand what happened to them. Not because they deserve our sympathy, the record does not support sympathy, and the historian who reaches for it here is reaching for comfort, not truth, but because the shape of their failure is the shape of the lesson, and the lesson is what we are here for. The Vaalthari are, and I use the present tense deliberately, because they still exist, diminished and restructured, and the question of what they are now versus what they were is central to this account, a species of extraordinary cognitive capacity. Their brains process spatial relationships at speeds that no natural-born species in the Concordat can match. They think in 3 dimensions the way the rest of us think in 1. This gave them, over their evolutionary history, and then over their spacefaring history, a profound advantage in every domain where spatial reasoning matters: architecture, engineering, navigation, and most critically, military strategy. For 9,000 years, the Vaalthari had never lost a war. This is not an exaggeration for dramatic effect. The historical record is clear: 47 distinct military conflicts across their spacefaring history, 47 victories, some of them narrow, some of them expensive, none of them defeats. They had turned this record into a doctrine, and the doctrine into an identity, and the identity into, eventually, a kind of civilizational religion. The belief that Vaalthari strategic thought was the apex of military intelligence in the known galaxy, and that any species which faced them in open conflict was, at the level of fundamental cognitive architecture, already outmatched. Humanity encountered the Vaalthari in the year 3847 of the Unified Reckoning, what humans in their own calendar call the early 26th century. The encounter was not initially military. It was commercial. A human deep-range trade convoy, operating in the outer Kessel Expanse, made contact with a Vaalthari survey vessel in a system that both species charts listed as unclaimed. The first meeting was, by all accounts, cordial. The Vaalthari survey commander, a male of the elder caste named Shalte Thorvan, filed a report with the Dominion's Expansion Bureau that described humans as a recently spacefaring species of moderate technical development, high verbal facility, and apparent emotional volatility. He recommended standard colonial contact protocols. The Expansion Bureau accepted his recommendation. Standard colonial contact protocols, in Vaalthari diplomatic language, meant a framework of engagement designed to establish commercial relationships, identify resource-sharing opportunities, and gradually, through economic dependency and information asymmetry, position the Dominion as the senior partner in any joint developmental ventures. It was not colonialism in the brutal, explicit sense. It was colonialism in the polite sense, which is in many ways more insidious because it is harder to name. Humanity, for its part, was aware of what was happening. The Terran Diplomatic Corps internal assessments of the Vaalthari from the first 5 years of contact are preserved in the New Carthage archive, and they are models of precise, unsentimental analysis. The senior xenodiplomatic analyst, a woman named Dr. Priya Chandrasekhar, wrote in her 3rd annual review of the relationship. Internal Assessment, Terran Diplomatic Corps, Senior Analyst Dr. Priya Chandrasekhar, Earth 3852, Classified Mercury Tier, recovered from the New Carthage archive. The Vaalthari believe they are building a dependency relationship with us. They are correct that this is their intention. Whether they are correct that it is succeeding is a separate question. My assessment is that we should allow them to continue believing the dependency is developing as planned. The commercial relationship is genuinely beneficial to our outer colonies. The intelligence access it provides to Vaalthari trade routes, resource maps, communication infrastructure, and strategic doctrine is significant and accumulating. There is a cost to this patience. The cost is that some of our people in the outer expanse will experience the condescension that accompanies being the junior partner in an asymmetric relationship. I recommend we pay that cost. What we are learning is worth it. What we are learning. NG is worth it. Read that again. In Earth 3852, 5 years into contact, a human analyst was already framing the relationship not as an economic partnership, but as an intelligence collection exercise. The Vaalthari would not have believed this if you had told them. They would have been genuinely, sincerely unable to credit it. Not because they were foolish, they were not foolish, but because their entire strategic worldview was built on the premise that smaller, newer, cognitively limited species did not play this kind of game. They played it. The Vaalthari played the long game. Smaller species reacted. The conflict that eventually came did not arrive suddenly. It arrived the way tides arrive, gradually, then all at once. The trigger event in Earth 3871 was a Vaalthari Expansion Bureau decision to formally claim 3 systems in the Kessel Expanse that 2 of humanity's outer colonies depended on for trade route access. The claim was technically legal under the Expanse's loosely defined territorial protocols. It was also, in practical terms, an economic stranglehold. Without those transit systems, the outer colonies would be entirely dependent on Vaalthari shipping contracts for supply lines. The Vaalthari Expansion Bureau knew this. The records confirm they knew this. It was, in their assessment, a routine consolidation move, the kind of thing they had done 43 times with other species over 9,000 years. Humanity's public response was diplomatic protests, formal objections through the Expanse's commercial arbitration framework, and a series of strongly worded communications from the Terran Assembly's Foreign Affairs Directorate. The Vaalthari Strategic Command reviewed these responses and filed an assessment. The assessment classified humanity as low risk, high compliance probability, and recommended that the Dominion hold its position. Humanity's private response was something else entirely, but we will come to that. The formal conflict began in Earth 3874, when the Vaalthari Dominion's second expansion fleet, 47 warships, considered a moderate-sized force by Dominion standards, moved to enforce territorial sovereignty over the claimed systems by interdicting a human cargo convoy. The convoy's escorts fired warning shots. The expansion fleet returned fire, disabled 2 escort vessels, and impounded the cargo. The Terran Assembly declared a state of active conflict 3 days later. The Vaalthari Strategic Command received the declaration, reviewed it, and this detail is preserved verbatim in their session records, laughed. Not metaphorically. The session records note, in the dry administrative language of Vaalthari bureaucracy, that the chamber expressed auditory amusement. They then proceeded to plan what they estimated would be a 12-week campaign. What actually followed was 3 years of conventional warfare in which the Terran Expeditionary Fleet, smaller, less technically sophisticated, fighting at the end of long supply lines, lost ground steadily and at significant cost. This is the part of the story that most historical accounts focus on. They should not. The conventional warfare phase is important not because of what happened in it, but because of what did not happen. Specifically, for 3 years, as the Vaalthari advanced fleet systematically outmaneuvered the TEF at every engagement, winning battle after battle with the elegant spatial reasoning superiority they had cultivated over 9 millennia, they did not win the war. In Earth 3877, the Terran Assembly submitted a formal request for a ceasefire negotiation. The Vaalthari Strategic Command accepted, confident. Their records show this confidence in clinical detail, that the ceasefire would transition into a peace settlement. and the peace settlement would be, in effect, a capitulation dressed in diplomatic language. The ceasefire was declared on the 4th of Reckoning Month 2, 3877. Humanity went quiet. Vaalthari sensor networks, monitoring the human systems, noted a significant reduction in military movement, communication traffic, and supply chain activity. Their analysts interpreted this as the expected reduction in wartime operations that follows a ceasefire declaration. They were wrong about what the silence meant. They were wrong about nearly everything that followed. Here is what the Vaalthari did not know, could not know, had no framework for knowing. The ceasefire request had been planned. Not reactively planned, not the desperate plea of a losing force looking for breathing room. Planned, mapped out in a strategy document dated 3871, 3 years before the formal conflict began, authored by a team of 7 people working under the directorship of Admiral General Sayoni Tuilaga Nakamura, head of the Terran Expeditionary Fleet's Strategic Planning Division. The document was classified at the highest available tier. It was called, in the dry institutional language that military planners favor, operational framework, extended temporal engagement, Vaalthari Theater. Its informal name, used by the people who wrote it and the people who eventually executed it, was simply the patient. The patient's core premise was this: humanity could not defeat the Vaalthari in conventional warfare. The cognitive gap in spatial reasoning was real, and it was significant, and it manifested most powerfully in the kind of three-dimensional tactical improvisation at which the Vaalthari excelled. A human fleet commander thinking in 3 dimensions was working. The Strategic Planning Division's own assessment was brutally honest about this. At approximately 60 to 70% of the situational awareness capacity of a Vaalthari commander of equivalent seniority. This was not a gap that training could close. It was architectural. It was the way human brains were built. What human brains were built for, the document argued, was something else. Something the Vaalthari, in 9,000 years of strategic supremacy, had never needed to develop a counter to, because no species they had faced had been built for it either. Infiltration, not the tactical kind, not sneaking scouts past a perimeter. The other kind, the deep, patient, generational, civilizational kind. The kind that requires not individual brilliance but collective discipline. The kind that requires a species to be willing to look like it is losing for as long as it takes. The patient's operational framework had 4 phases. Phase 1 was the conventional warfare phase, fought not to win, but to establish a specific profile in Vaalthari strategic assessment. The TEF was to engage competently but not brilliantly. Win engagements when tactically efficient, lose them when the cost of winning was too high. Establish, in Vaalthari records, the image of a species that was determined but limited. A species that fought well within its cognitive ceiling but could not transcend it. A species that, eventually and predictably, would exhaust itself against Vaalthari superiority and seek terms. This is what makes Phase 1 remarkable, and what makes it, frankly, one of the most extraordinary things I have encountered in 40 years of historical scholarship. Humanity's military commanders, professional officers, trained to win, personally invested in the outcome of every engagement they fought, were asked to fight a war with a strategic purpose they could not tell their crews about. They could not explain that the losses were partly intentional. They could not tell their people that some of the ground they were ceding was being ceded on purpose. They simply had to lead, and lose where loss was tactically optimal for the larger plan, and watch their people die for a strategy that would not bear fruit for decades. The personal accounts from this period are, in this historian's view, among the most difficult documents in the archive to read. Private Journal, Fleet Captain Adesola Babatundres, TEF Carrier Group 7, 3875, Day 312, recovered from the Babatundres family archive by the Interstellar Historical Concordance. We pulled back from the Denhar corridor today. The Vaalthari swept through it in 6 hours, exactly as Command predicted they would. My second officer, Commander Park, asked me afterward why we gave the corridor up without more of a fight. I told her the strategic calculus didn't favor a sustained engagement. That is true. It is not the whole truth. I have been carrying half-truths for 2 years now, and they are heavier than I thought half-truths could be. I look at my crew and I see people who trust me completely, and I am not lying to them. I am withholding from them the one thing that would make every sacrifice comprehensible. I keep telling myself, this is what they signed up for. Service means sometimes not knowing why. But tonight I am not sure I believe that. Tonight I think they deserve to know. Maybe after. Maybe there will be an after where I can tell them and they can decide for themselves whether it was worth it. There would be an after, but Captain Babitundres would not see it. She was killed in the Battle of Den Haarich in 3876, 11 months after that journal entry, in an engagement that the TEF fought and lost on purpose, because controlling the timing of that loss was worth more to Phase 1's profile establishment than winning the battle would have been. She knew this going in. Her final tactical log entry, filed 6 hours before the engagement, contains one line that the historians of her generation have debated endlessly. Tell them it was worth it, because it was. They just won't know why yet. Phase 2 began the moment the ceasefire was declared. The Vaalthari saw reduced military movement, reduced communication traffic, reduced supply chain activity. A species standing down, preparing for negotiation, behaving exactly as a species in their strategic position should behave. What was actually happening across 14 human systems simultaneously was the most ambitious covert operation in Terran history. The reduction in visible military activity was real. The TEF was genuinely pulling back from forward positions. What replaced it was invisible by design. 5,000 individuals, recruited over the previous 4 years from the TEF Special Operations Command, the Terran Intelligence Bureau, the Civilian Deep Space Exploration Services, and this detail has always struck me as remarkable, a significant number of academics, xenolinguists, cultural anthropologists, spatial cognition researchers, engineers specializing in Vaalthari standard systems. They went dark. Not dark as in hidden, dark as in structurally absent from any record that Vaalthari intelligence systems could reach. They went into Vaalthari space. Not as spies exactly, though they were spies in function. They went as the texture of the background. Maintenance workers on Vaalthari commercial stations, cargo handlers on mixed-species trade routes, environmental technicians on the kind of deep infrastructure installations that large empires build and then forget to watch carefully, because large empires have a lot of infrastructure and a limited number of hours in the day. They went in 1s and 2s and 3s, over months and then years, carrying cover identities that had been built over the previous 4 years, with a thoroughness that the Vaalthari's intelligence assessors, reviewing human capabilities, had assessed as beyond humanity's organizational capacity. This assessment was wrong, not because human intelligence agencies were better than the Vaalthari believed, though they were, but because the Vaalthari's model of human organizational capacity was based on what humans had done before, in contexts where humanity was operating openly. It did not account for what humans could do when operating covertly with full civilizational commitment and a 4-year head start. The operations architect, the person who designed the cover identity framework, the insertion protocols, the communication structure, and the long-term intelligence collection strategy, was a woman named Director Nneka Okonkwo Vasquez, head of the Terran Intelligence Bureau's Special Operations Directorate. She was 41 years old when the patient was drafted. She was 58 by the time the ceasefire was declared and Phase 2 began. She had spent 17 years building, in absolute secrecy, the infrastructure of what would become the largest human intelligence penetration of a foreign civilization in recorded history. There is exactly one record of her speaking about the project outside of classified briefings. It was a private conversation with Admiral General Tuilaga Nakamura, recorded without either of their knowledge, by a routine security sweep of the Admiral General's office. The recording was discovered 40 years after the fact and is now one of the most studied documents in strategic history. Audio recording, private conversation, Director Nneka Okonkwo Vasquez and Admiral General Sayoni Tuilaga Nakamura, T Strategic Command, New Geneva, Earth 3877, Day 44, recovered from the New Geneva Command Archive Security Logs. TUILAGINAKMURA. How long before we have enough to move? OKONKWOVSQUZ. Define enough. TUILAGINAKMURA. Enough to be certain. OKONKWOVSQUZ. Sayoni, we will never be certain. Certain is not a thing that exists in this work. What exists is enough to make their response too slow to matter. That is what I am building toward. That is a different thing. TUILAGINAKMURA. How long for that? OKONKWOVSQUZ. 6 years, maybe 8. The people are in place. Now we wait for the information to accumulate. You cannot hurry accumulation. TUILAGINAKMURA. 6 to 8 years. OKONKWOVSQUZ. At least. This is the part where we are patient. This is the part where the other side relaxes and we watch them relax and we learn everything there is to learn about them while they are comfortable. Comfortable people are honest. Honest systems have seams. We are finding the seams. We are finding the seams. For 7 years, through the ceasefire period, through 3 rounds of peace negotiations that humanity deliberately extended without resolution, through what the Vaalthari's diplomatic corps described in their internal communications as increasingly tedious human proceduralism. For 7 years, the 5,000 went deeper. They mapped the Vaalthari military's command and control architecture. They identified the frequency protocols for fleet communications. They located the physical routing nodes for the Dominion's strategic data network, a network the Vaalthari had never bothered encrypting at its physical layer, because the physical layer was inside Dominion space, and who would be in Dominion space without authorization? They identified the 12 systems that served as logistical anchors for the Ray military supply chain. They identified the 6 individuals in the Vaalthari Strategic Command whose decisions, in any military engagement, would determine the Dominion's response. And they identified something else, something that Director Okonkwo Vasquez had suspected from the early analysis, but had needed years to confirm, the seam in the Vaalthari's strategic architecture that made everything else possible. The Vaalthari's cognitive supremacy in spatial reasoning made them extraordinary tactical improvisers. In real-time, 3-dimensional combat, a Vaalthari commander was genuinely better than anything humanity could field, and genuinely better by a margin that training could not close. But that same cognitive architecture, the one that allowed them to hold hundreds of variables in spatial relationships simultaneously, had a limitation that the Vaalthari's 9,000 years of unbroken victory had never forced them to discover. They were slow to update. Not unintelligent, the opposite. Their pattern recognition systems were so sophisticated, and their pattern libraries so deep and so validated by millennia of success, that when new information arrived which did not fit existing patterns, their cognitive architecture defaulted to the existing pattern and reinterpreted the new information to fit it. A human brain, faced with information that doesn't fit its model, experiences dissonance, an uncomfortable signal that something is wrong. The Vaalthari brain, faced with the same information, experienced something their own neurologists called pattern precedence. The existing model was so strongly weighted that the anomalous information was simply absorbed into it, reinterpreted, and filed. The model was not updated. The model was protected. 9,000 years of always being right had made the Vaalthari constitutionally incapable of believing they were wrong. This was the seam. This was what the 7 years were confirming. And when Director Okonkwo Vasquez filed her final Phase 2 assessment in Earth 3884, she concluded with 3 sentences that the Interstellar Historical Concordance has since inscribed, with her family's permission, on the wall of the Institute's Strategic Studies Gallery. Final Phase 2 Assessment, Director Nneka Okonkwo Vasquez, Terran Intelligence Bureau Special Operations Directorate, Earth 3884, Classified Absolute Tier, recovered from the New Carthage Archive. The Vaalthari do not believe we are inside their lines. They cannot believe it because their model of us does not allow for it. We have used their model of us against them. We are ready. The silence is over. What the galaxy experienced in the first 72 hours of Earth 3884, Month 6, Day 1, was not a battle. It was a sequence. A carefully timed, precisely orchestrated sequence of events that unfolded across 9 star systems simultaneously, and which the Vaalthari Strategic Command spent the first 48 hours of that sequence attempting to fit into existing pattern categories before arriving, too late and with great difficulty, at the correct one. Let us reconstruct it as it was experienced, from multiple perspectives, because no single vantage point contains the whole picture. At 300 hours, Vaalthari Standard Fleet Time, the communication network of the Dominion's 3rd expansion fleet went dark. Not jammed, jammed would have produced a recognizable interference signature. Dark, as if the network had simply ceased to exist. Fleet Admiral Shalu Van Teth, nephew of the survey commander who had first categorized humanity as moderate technical development 37 years earlier, was on the bridge of his flagship, the Supremacy of Reason, when his communications officer reported the blackout. His bridge log records his response. Bridge log, VDF Flagship Supremacy of Reason, Fleet Admiral Shalu Van Teth, Earth 3884, Month 6, Day 1, 3:01 hours, recovered from Vaalthari Dominion Military Archive by the Interstellar Historical Concordance. Admiral's response to communications blackout. Admiral stated, quote, "Run diagnostic. It is a system fault." Diagnostic requested 030114. Diagnostic returned 030152. Result, all systems nominal. Network is present. Network is functional. Network is receiving no traffic. Admiral stated, quote, "Then someone on the other end has cut the line. Find out which node." Node trace requested 030201. Node trace result. Traffic is being generated at all expected sources. Traffic is not arriving. Admiral stated, quote, "That is impossible." Second officer stated, quote, "Yes, sir. It is occurring anyway." At 3:12 hours, across 11 Vaalthari commercial transit stations in the Kessel Expanse and 3 adjacent systems, maintenance contractors filed simultaneous requests for emergency access to restricted systems, citing critical infrastructure failures. These requests were processed, at 3 of the 11 stations, by human personnel who had been embedded in the station's administrative workforce for between 2 and 6 years. The requests were approved. At 3:18 hours, the physical routing nodes for the Dominion's strategic data network, the ones whose locations had taken 3 years of embedded intelligence work to identify, experienced simultaneous failures. Not hacking, not electronic warfare. Physical failures produced by physical presence. The quiet, patient, unhurried work of people who had been there long enough to know exactly which components, removed in exactly which sequence, produced irreversible cascade failure without triggering automated alerts. At 3:18 hours and 42 seconds, the Vaalthari Strategic Command, on their homeworld 4 light hours away, lost access to real-time data from every military installation in the Kessel Expanse. A Vaalthari intelligence analyst named Prethvasunel was on night duty at Strategic Command's monitoring center when the data loss registered. She was 26 years old, 7 years into her career, and had been trained on the assumption that the threats her monitoring center would face would come from outside Dominion space. What she saw on her display at 3:19 hours did not fit that assumption. She did what junior analysts do. She escalated. The senior watch officer, a male of the elder caste named Harneth Val, received her escalation at 3:23 hours. He reviewed the data loss. He reviewed the communications blackout reports coming in, one after another, from multiple fleet elements. He reviewed the infrastructure failure reports from the commercial stations. And then he did what 9,000 years of pattern precedence had trained him to do. He tried to fit it into an existing category. His initial assessment, filed at 3:41 hours, classified the events as coordinated technical failure, likely cascade origin, possibly related to the ion storm activity in Grid Sector 7 recorded the previous week. He recommended a diagnostic sweep and requested maintenance crews be dispatched to affected nodes. Preth Vasunel, the junior analyst, filed a dissenting annotation on his assessment at 3:44 hours. She wrote 3 words, "This is deliberate." Then she added, because she was 26 and uncertain, and the culture of her institution weighted seniority heavily, "Recommend further analysis before classification." She was not wrong, but the annotation was filed and noted and left in queue for morning review. At 400 hours, the TEF reappeared. Not gradually, not with forward elements probing for response. All at once, fold transit signatures bloomed across the Kessel expanse and 3 adjacent systems simultaneously. A feat of coordinated navigation that required every vessel to make its transit within a 40-second window, because the tactical plan depended on the Vaalthari's response systems being presented with a complete picture faster than their pattern precedence architecture could process it incrementally. The TEF had been practicing this coordinated transit for 4 years. The timing was within 11 seconds of perfect. 214 human vessels. Not the largest fleet humanity had ever fielded, but not the aging, cobbled-together force the Vaalthari had fought in the conventional phase either. In 7 years, the TEF had been rebuilt. Not in public, not in ways that Vaalthari intelligence surveillance would easily detect, rebuilt in distributed shipyards across outer colony systems that the Dominion's sensor networks did not consider worth monitoring. Rebuilt to a doctrine that had been written specifically for this moment. Not to win engagements through spatial reasoning superiority, which humanity could not match, but to deny the Vaalthari the conditions under which spatial reasoning superiority was decisive. The doctrine was called, in TEF internal nomenclature, close fog. The principle: if you cannot outthink an enemy in open 3-dimensional space, you remove the open 3-dimensional space. You fight in the fog, the electronic, communications, and sensor fog that the 7 years of embedded operations had made possible. You fight where your enemy's greatest asset is neutralized, not by matching it, but by removing the environment it requires. Fleet Admiral Shaluavanteth received the fold transit alerts on his bridge at 040043. He immediately recognized that this was not a technical failure. His bridge log records his first order: battle stations, fleet formation Keth 7. They are here. Keth 7 was a defensive formation designed for an unexpected engagement without communication support. It was the correct formation. It was also, in this instance, insufficient, not because of anything the TEF did in the next 30 seconds, but because Keth 7 assumed a fleet commander would have real-time sensor data from which to adapt the formation as the engagement developed. Without the data network, Fleet Admiral Shaluavanteth was navigating by the light of what his own ship sensors could see. And his own ship sensors were, at 4:01 hours, being systematically degraded by electronic warfare packages that had been prepositioned, physically, by embedded personnel, on 3 of the system's relay buoys over the previous 8 months. He was not blind. He was fog-bound. And a Vaalthari commander in fog is not the same thing as a Vaalthari commander in clear space. In clear space, they see everything and process everything and are extraordinary. In fog, they see fragments, and the fragment pattern does not match any of the 9,000 years of accumulated pattern library, and the pattern precedence architecture searches for a match, and the search takes time, and in the seconds that the search takes, things happen. Things happened. The Battle of the Kessel Expanse, which is what historians call it, though it was really 4 simultaneous engagements across 3 systems, lasted 19 hours. The outcome, in military terms, was decisive. 11 Vaalthari warships destroyed, 23 disabled and captured. The Dominion's forward logistics network in the Expanse severed at every anchor point, and the 3 systems in dispute returned to human operational control by the end of the first day. Human losses were significant but far below what any Vaalthari strategic model had predicted for a force of equivalent size engaging a comparable Vaalthari fleet. The Dominion's post-battle analysis, filed 6 days later, attempted to account for the discrepancy by identifying tactical errors in Vaalthari command decisions. It could not quite bring itself to say what was actually true, that humanity had planned this for 7 years, had been inside their lines for most of that time, and that the battle had effectively been won before a single shot was fired. There was a senior Vaalthari diplomat named Vaalthari who was, at the moment the battle began, in the middle of the 4th round of peace negotiations with the Terran Assembly's diplomatic delegation at the neutral station of Colorum 7. He received word of the Fold transit signatures at 4:15 hours, 15 minutes after they registered, through a backup communication channel because the primary network was down. His aide brought him the message mid-session. He read it. He looked up at the human delegation across the table, 3 people he had spent 4 years negotiating with, who had been, in his assessment, cooperative if occasionally frustrating partners in an admittedly slow process. He looked at them for a long moment. The lead human negotiator, a woman named Ambassador Kioma Estanaka, met his eyes. She did not speak. She did not need to. Her expression, described by Vaalthari himself in his memoir, written 20 years later, was not triumphant. It was not unkind. It was simply, and here he searched for the word for 3 paragraphs before settling on it, patient. She looked patient, like someone who had been waiting without impatience for exactly this moment to arrive. That was when I understood, he wrote. Not what had happened, I would not fully understand that for months, but that it had been happening for a long time, that the table I thought we were both sitting at was not the table that mattered, and that they had known the whole time which table mattered. The peace settlement signed in 3885, 9 months after the Battle of the Kessel Expanse, is sometimes described as generous. The Vaalthari were not dismembered. Their core systems were not occupied. Their cultural institutions were not abolished. In the conventional language of post-war settlements, humanity's terms were restrained. They were also complete. The 3 disputed systems were confirmed as human territory. A mutual intelligence-sharing framework was established, which meant, in practice, that the Vaalthari now understood they had no intelligence secrets from humanity, and behaved accordingly. The Dominion's Expansion Bureau was dissolved under the settlement's terms and replaced by a joint development commission with equal human and Vaalthari representation. And most significantly, humanity was granted a permanent seat on the Kessel Expanse's Multi-Species Governance Council, not as a junior partner, not as a provisional member, not as a species whose status would be reviewed in 10 years. A permanent seat, by right. The Vaalthari signed. They signed because they had no alternative and because, and this is something the record captures clearly in the testimony of the Dominion settlement delegation, they had been shown something that genuinely changed their understanding of what they were dealing with, not the battle, not the military outcome, the 7 years before the battle. When that was fully disclosed to them in the settlement process, when they understood the full scope of what had been embedded in their space, for how long, and with what thoroughness, the Vaalthari settlement delegatio went through something that their own psychological literature did not quite have a category for. It was not defeat in the military sense. It was the experience of realizing that the model of reality you have been operating from for 9,000 years is wrong about something fundamental, that the species you categorized as limited were not limited in the ways you thought, that the silence you interpreted as compliance was, all along, preparation. The lead Vaalthari settlement delegate, Eldercast Shen Vathoru, said something in the final session that was recorded in the official minutes and has been quoted in every account of these events since. The human delegation had just confirmed the terms of the intelligence sharing framework. Shen Vathoru looked at the human delegation for a moment and said, "How long have you been capable of this?" Ambassador Estanaka replied after a pause, "We have always been capable of this. You were not looking for it. You were not looking for it." 6 words. In them, the entire history of the misunderstanding. Now let us talk about the fundamental error. Not as criticism, I am a historian, not a prosecutor, but as a matter of genuine analytical interest. Because the Vaalthari's error was not unique to the Vaalthari. It was the same error, committed in different forms, by the Orathi Concordat in the account I gave you last century, and by a dozen other civilizations in cases this institute has documented. It is, I have come to believe, a structural temptation of advanced civilizations, and understanding it is the purpose of this entire account. The error is this: when a civilization achieves a genuine cognitive or technological superiority in a specific domain, it tends to organize its entire strategic worldview around that superiority. The superiority becomes the lens through which everything else is evaluated. Other species are assessed in terms of how they relate to that superiority. Are they approaching it? Are they far below it? The question that tends not to be asked is, what domains does our superiority not apply to? What can they do that our superiority does not address? The Vaalthari's spatial reasoning superiority was real. It was decisive in open, clear, information-rich three-dimensional combat. It was irrelevant in fog. It was irrelevant in the 7 years before the battle. It was irrelevant in the quiet rooms where humans built cover identities, and in the maintenance corridors where humans learned the seams of Vaalthari infrastructure, and in the negotiating sessions where humans practiced patience as a weapon, and in the 40-year conversation between Director Okonkwo Vasquez and Admiral General Tuilaga Nakamura about how long it takes to make the other side comfortable enough to be honest. The Vaalthari were better at the game they knew they were playing. They were not playing the game humanity was playing, and humanity had chosen, with extraordinary deliberateness, not to tell them which game it was. What does the galaxy become after a moment like this? It becomes more careful. Not necessarily wiser. History is reluctant to support optimism about wisdom accumulating cleanly across civilizations, but more careful. The Kessel Expanse Governance Council, now in its 240th year of operation, includes representation from 11 species, and its founding charter contains a clause that was specifically requested by the Vaalthari delegation in 3885. The clause reads, "No member species shall categorize another member species' capabilities on the basis of observed performance in a single domain, without documented assessment of all domains to which the other species' capabilities may extend." It is called, formally, the Capability Humility Provision. Informally, it is known, throughout the Expanse's diplomatic community, as the Human Clause. Vaalthari know it by that name. They use it without apparent embarrassment. This, too, is something the historical record finds worth noting, that the species who was outmaneuvered, who had the record corrected for them in the hardest possible way, responded not by retreating into denial, but by encoding the lesson into their institutional architecture. This says something about the Vaalthari that their 9,000 years of strategic supremacy had obscured. They were, when forced to it, capable of learning. The supremacy had simply never forced them to it before. I should tell you about Preth Vasunel, the junior analyst who, at 3:44 hours on the morning of 3884, month 6, day 1, annotated her superior's report with 3 words. This is deliberate. She was right. She was right before anyone else in the Vaalthari command structure was right, And she was right because she was 26 years old and had not yet accumulated enough pattern precedents to override the signal her eyes were sending her brain. She had not yet learned, in other words, to not see what was there. She retired from Vaalthari military service in 3891. She spent the following 30 years as an independent scholar. Her major work, a study of pattern precedence failure in strategic intelligence analysis, drawing on the events of 3884, is considered one of the foundational texts of the field. She dedicated it to the 5,000 humans who spent 7 years in Vaalthari space, whose names were declassified in 3893. To those who were patient, the dedication reads, from one who learned too late to look. I think about that dedication often. This is the 5119th year of the unified reckoning. You who are receiving this account are more than 1,200 years removed from the events I have described. The Kessel Expanse is, by now, not a contested border region, but the heart of one of the most commercially and culturally productive multi-species zones in the known galaxy. The Vaalthari Dominion is neither dominant nor a dominion anymore. It is a partner civilization in a framework that their own expansion bureau would not have recognized as a possible outcome in 3847. Humanity's Terran expeditionary fleet, the one that fought and strategically lost and quietly prepared and ultimately prevailed, is now the core of a joint defense architecture that includes 6 species and has not fought a major engagement in 4 centuries. These outcomes were not inevitable. They were not the product of some cosmic trend toward justice or progress. They were the product of choices, specific, costly, human choices, made across decades, by people who would not live to see the outcome they were working toward. Captain Babatunde Drays, who pulled back from the Denhar corridor and wrote in her journal about the weight of half-truths. Dr. Chandrasekhar Rose, who recognized in 3852 that information was the real resource. Director Okonkwo Vasquez, who spent 17 years building an infrastructure of presence inside a space that was not supposed to contain her. The 5,000 who went in 1s and 2s and 3s, with cover identities and patience, and the accumulated cultural knowledge of a species that had spent 300,000 years learning how to survive being underestimated. The lesson is not that silence is always preparation, though sometimes it is. The lesson is not that appearing weak is always strategy, though sometimes it is. The lesson is what it has always been, in every iteration of this story that this institute has preserved, that the most dangerous failure mode of any civilization is to mistake its own categories for the truth about other civilizations, to look at a species and see a type rather than a history, to hear silence and hear surrender, rather than asking what, in the silence, is being built. They thought the silence meant surrender. They were not wrong that something was ending. They were wrong about what. On the morning of month 6, day 3, 3884, 2 days after the Battle of the Kessel Expanse, when the outcome was confirmed and the ceasefire of a different kind was being negotiated, the first public statement from the Terran Assembly was delivered by Director General Kofi Asantbonsu, great-grandson of 2 of the officers who had fought in the conventional phase. He delivered it not as a victory speech. He delivered it, by all accounts, quietly. He said, Public Address, Director General Kofi Asantbonsu, Terran Assembly, 3884, month 6, day 3. From the official Terran Assembly record, corroborated by 14 independent news transcripts. We did not do this because we wanted a war. We did not do this because we are better than anyone. We did this because we were told very clearly that we did not matter enough to be seen. And the only answer to that, the only honest answer, is to make yourself impossible to miss, not through noise but through presence, not through dominance but through depth. We have been here the whole time. We were simply waiting for the right moment to be visible. We have been here the whole time. We were simply waiting for the right moment to be visible. I have read 10,000 primary source documents in the preparation of this account. I have read battle logs and intelligence reports and personal journals and diplomatic cables, and the private correspondence of people who made decisions that shaped centuries. And I have come back, again and again, to those two sentences. Not because they are the most eloquent thing any human has ever said, they are not, but because they are the most true. Because they describe in the simplest possible language what happened, what the silence was, what the patience was for, what it meant in the end to be a species that had been told it did not matter and had decided, very quietly, very thoroughly, over a very long time to prove otherwise. Remember it. Tell it to whoever needs to hear it. Because somewhere in the galaxy, right now, there is a civilization that has decided another civilization does not matter enough to be seen. And somewhere else, receiving that judgment, there is a species learning what patience is for.